Hey, imagine this. I'm scrubbing dishes, my husband's passed out, and my stepson walks in. Bam, one look and everything flips. A touch that feels like fire, a secret that could ruin us, and then, boom, a letter that changes it all. What's in it? Why'd he come back? Stick around, 'cause this twist will blow your mind. I was standing at the sink, scrubbing a plate so hard I swear I could have scraped the glaze right off. My hands were shaking a little. Not from the cold water, but from something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Outside, the night had swallowed up the last bits of daylight, leaving nothing but a thick, heavy darkness pressing against the window. In the living room, my husband Dan, 42, was sprawled out on the couch, snoring loud enough to rattle the walls. He'd stumbled in from his shift at the factory a couple hours ago, barely touched his meatloaf and grabbed a beer instead. Now an empty bottle dangled from his limp hand, and the TV was mumbling some weather report nobody was listening to. Just another Tuesday in our little house on the edge of town. I sighed, setting the plate on the drying rack, and wiped my hands on a towel that'd seen better days. Dan's snores were like background noise at this point, familiar but not comforting. He wasn't a bad guy, don't get me wrong. He worked hard, paid the bills, but he was barely here, even when he was. Years of long shifts and longer nights had turned him into a ghost in his own home. I'd gotten used to it, or at least I told myself I had. But that night, the quiet felt heavier than usual, like it was sitting on my chest. Then I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming down the hall. I turned, and there was Jake, my stepson, 22, leaning against the doorway. His dark hair was a mess, falling into his eyes, and he had this look, fresh, curious but careful, like he was testing the waters. He glanced toward the living room, then back at me. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry. "You okay, Lindsay?" I forced a small smile, nodding. "Yeah, just cleaning up." He stepped into the kitchen, his sneakers scuffing the linoleum. "Dad's out cold already, huh?" I gave him a look, the kind that says more than words. "You could say that." Jake let out a quiet huff, almost a laugh, and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. He'd changed so much since I first met him years ago, back when he was this lanky kid who barely said 2 words. Now he was taller than me, broad-shouldered with this quiet confidence that sneaked up on you. I tried not to notice it too much, but lately it was hard to miss. "Everything good?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I said, turning back to the sink to rinse a glass I didn't need to rinse. "Just keeping busy." He didn't buy it. I could tell by the way he tilted his head, watching me. "You're always busy. You ever take a break?" I shrugged, brushing it off. "Someone's got to keep this place running." He didn't say anything for a second, just stood there, his eyes steady on me. It wasn't the usual quick glance you'd expect from a stepson. It was deeper, like he was seeing something I didn't want him to see. My pulse kicked up a notch, and I hated that it did. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know," he said, his voice softer now. I looked up at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "You take care of Dad, the house, me sometimes," he said, stepping a little closer. "But who's taking care of you?" The question hit me like a slap. Simple, but heavy. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because the truth was, nobody did. Dan was gone half the time, physically or otherwise, and I'd learned to handle things on my own. I'd gotten good at it too. Maybe too good. "I manage," I said finally, though it sounded weak even to me. Jake's jaw tightened a little, like he wanted to argue but held back. Instead, he reached past me for a glass, his fingers brushing mine for half a second. It was quick, accidental, but it felt like a spark, like when you touch a doorknob after dragging your feet on carpet. I yanked my hand back, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. He froze too, glass in hand, and for a beat, neither of us moved. The air buzzed, thick with something I couldn't name. "Jake!" I started, but Dan's voice cut through from the living room, slurred and loud. "Lindsay, grab me another beer, would ya?" I flinched, the moment shattering. Jake's eyes flicked toward the sound, his expression hardening for a split second before softening again. I put a hand on his arm. Light, quick, just enough to say I've got this. I'll handle it, I said, keeping my voice low. He nodded, stepping aside, but his gaze lingered on me as I grabbed a cold one from the fridge. I walked it out to Dan, setting it on the coffee table with a tight smile. He grunted a "thanks, hun," without looking up from the TV, already half asleep again. When I got back to the kitchen, Jake was still there, sipping his water, looking more relaxed but not entirely. "He'll crash soon," I said, trying to lighten things up. "Yeah," Jake said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Like clockwork." We both laughed, a quiet shared thing that cut through the tension. But then the silence crept back in, and I felt his eyes on me again. Steady, unflinching. My breath hitched, and I turned to meet his gaze. "Lindsay," he started, his voice low, like he was about to say something big. But Dan's snores kicked up, rumbling through the house, and we both froze, listening. It was loud, obnoxious, and, thank God, consistent. He was out. Jake exhaled, shaking his head with a small laugh. "That didn't take long." "Nope," I said, my voice quieter now. The room felt different all of a sudden, like the space between us had shrunk without either of us moving. I grabbed a dish towel, fussing with it just to keep my hands busy, but I could still feel him there, solid and close. "You should get some rest," he said, softer this time. "You've been running on fumes." "I'm fine, Jake," I said, but the way he looked at me, like he saw right through the lie, made my chest tighten. "Okay," he said, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. "Good night, Lindsay." "Good night," I replied, watching him head down the hall to his room. I stood there after he left, the towel still in my hands, my mind racing. That spark when he touched me, it wasn't nothing. It was something, and it scared me. I didn't know what to do with it, but one thing was clear. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot. See, here's the thing. I'm not saying this to judge anyone. Life's messy, right? We all get lonely sometimes, and maybe that's what this was. Or maybe it was more, I don't know yet, but looking back, I wonder if I should have seen it coming. What do you think? Can a single moment like that change everything, or am I overthinking it? I couldn't sleep. The house was dead quiet except for Dan's snores rattling through the walls like a busted chainsaw. I lay there staring at the ceiling, shadows from the streetlight creeping across it. Jake's words from earlier, "Who's taking care of you?" kept bouncing around in my head. I tried to shake them off, but they stuck like gum on a shoe. Dan was out cold in the living room, and here I was, wide awake, my heart racing for no good reason. Or maybe there was a reason and I just didn't want to admit it. I gave up on sleep around midnight, threw the covers off and padded down the hall in my socks. The living room lamp cast a faint glow, but I didn't even glance at Dan as I passed. He was a lump on the couch, nothing more. I hit the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and stood by the sink, staring out at the empty street. The cold water hit my throat, but it didn't calm me down. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me. My stomach flipped and I turned. Jake stood in the doorway wearing an old grey tee and sweatpants, his hair all messy like he'd been tossing in bed too. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to wake Dan. "Nope," I said, setting the glass down. My hands were shaky and I shoved them in my hoodie pockets to hide it. He stepped closer, leaning against the counter. "Me neither." We stood there, the silence stretching out, heavy and alive. I could feel him looking at me, not just a casual glance, but something deeper, something that made my chest tight. I shifted my weight, trying to play it cool, but my pulse was hammering. "You okay?" he asked, softer this time. "I don't know," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, me too." I leaned back against the counter, facing him full on. "What's on yours?" He hesitated, his eyes locked on mine. Then he said it, barely above a whisper. "You." The word hung there, sharp and electric. My breath caught, and I stared at him, my brain scrambling for something to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was just mixed up, but the way he looked at me, like he meant it, stopped me cold. "Jake," I started. The next night hit like déjà vu, but with a sharper edge. Dan came home from the factory, scarfed down some leftovers, and cracked open a beer before I'd even cleared the table. By the time the TV was blaring some rerun of a car chase show, he'd downed 3 more and was snoring on the couch, head tipped back, mouth open. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't run wild. Jake's words from last night, "I think about you," were still rattling around in my head, and that kiss, quick and shaky as it was, felt like it had burned itself into me. I scrubbed harder like I could wipe it away. Then I heard him, Jake's footsteps, soft but sure, coming down the hall. I didn't turn around right away, just kept my eyes on the sponge. He stopped at the counter, and I could feel him there, watching me. "He's out again, huh?" he said, his voice low, a little dry. "Like clockwork," I shot back, sharper than I meant to. I tossed the sponge in the sink and faced him. His hair was messy, his hands shoved in his pockets, but his eyes, they locked on mine and didn't let go. "You don't have to deal with this alone," he said, stepping closer. "Jake, we shouldn't—" I started, but my voice cracked and he cut me off with a look that said he wasn't backing down. "I know," he said, softer now, "but I can't help it, Lindsay. I meant what I said last night." My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to tell him to stop, to go back to his room, but my feet wouldn't move. The air between us buzzed like static before a storm. He took another step, close enough that I could smell the faint cedar from his shampoo. "This is crazy," I whispered, shaking my head. "We can't." "Just one more time," he said, his voice steady but pleading. "Then we're done, I promise." I stared at him, my brain screaming no, but my heart, God, my heart, was tired of being quiet. I don't know why I nodded, but I did, and that was it. He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing mine, and I didn't pull away. We slipped out of the kitchen, quiet as shadows, and headed to my room. The door clicked shut behind us, and for a second we just stood there, breathing fast, like we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. He stepped closer, and I didn't stop him. He leaned in close, and suddenly we connected, hesitant at first, then with more feeling, like something snapped loose. I held onto his shoulders, and for a second it was just us in that quiet space. The room was dark, just a sliver of moonlight sneaking through the blinds, and every sound, his breath, the creak of the floor, felt loud in the stillness. We stayed close, whispering stuff I can barely remember now, things like, "This is nuts," and "We shouldn't be doing this." But we did, and it felt like a weight lifting off me, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally let it out. It wasn't wild or reckless, just quiet, real, and way too intense. We didn't push it too far, kept it simple, but that connection, it hit me hard. I hadn't felt that alive in forever, not with Dan, not with anyone. We pulled back eventually, both of us shaky, and I pressed my forehead against his, trying to catch my breath. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely there. "I know," he said, but there was this edge to it, like he wasn't sure he meant it. We stayed like that for a minute, the silence thick but not heavy. Then reality kicked in. Dan was still snoring down the hall, oblivious, and here we were, tangled up in something we couldn't explain. I pulled away, smoothing my shirt like that'd fix everything. "You should go," I said, glancing at the door. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "Good night, Lindsay." "Good night," I whispered back, watching him slip out. The door clicked shut, and I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling. What the hell had we just done? It wasn't just a moment this time, it was bigger, and it shook me to my core. But part of me, buried deep, didn't regret it. Not yet. Morning came too fast. I woke up to sunlight stabbing through the curtains, my head pounding like I'd been up all night, which I pretty much had. Dan was still on the couch when I checked, a blanket half off him, beer bottles scattered like confetti. I made coffee, trying to act normal, but every sip tasted like guilt. Jake came in a little later, hair still a mess, avoiding my eyes at first. "Morning," he mumbled, grabbing a mug. "Morning," I said back, my voice tight. We stood there, the counter between us, pretending to care about coffee. Finally, he looked up. "Last night?" "We can't talk about it," I cut in, sharper than I meant. "It was a mistake, Jake. Done." He flinched, but his jaw set hard. "Didn't feel like a mistake." "Doesn't matter," I said, gripping my mug so tight my knuckles went white. "It's over. We're not doing this." He stared at me, and for a second I thought he'd push back. But then he nodded, slow, like it hurt. "Okay." I turned away, rinsing my mug in the sink, trying to drown out the noise in my head. I told myself it was the right call. Dan was right there, for God's sake. We couldn't keep playing with fire. But Jake's voice stuck with me, quiet and raw. "Didn't feel like a mistake." And the worst part? I wasn't sure it did either. That day dragged on, normal on the outside, but chaos underneath. Dan woke up eventually, grumbling about his head, and I played the part. Made him toast, nodded at his complaints. Jake stayed out of sight mostly, holed up in his room, but every time I passed his door, my stomach knotted up. We'd crossed a line last night, bigger than before, and I didn't know how to step back. I kept asking myself, was it wrong because it happened, or because I didn't hate it? Maybe both, maybe neither. All I knew was we couldn't let it happen again, no matter how much some part of me wanted it to. Days after that night in my room, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Dan kept up his usual: work, beer, couch, repeat, while I buzzed around, cleaning, cooking, anything to keep my hands moving and my mind off Jake. But it didn't work. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, thinking it was him. We'd barely talked since I told him it was over, but the air between us crackled whenever we crossed paths. I'd catch him looking at me, quick, quiet glances, and my stomach would flip. I hated it. I needed it to stop. One afternoon I was scrubbing the stove when Jake walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me. I kept my eyes on the grease stain, but I could feel him like a heat wave. "I'm heading to Mom's for a while," he said finally, his voice steady but low. I froze, sponge in hand, and turned to him. "What?" "I think it's better if I get some space," he said, shifting his weight. "Clear my head." My chest tightened, but I nodded. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," he said, meeting my eyes. "I talked to Dad already. I'm leaving tomorrow." I swallowed hard, the words sticking in my throat. "When did you decide this?" "Last night," he said, shrugging. "It's the right move, Lindsay, for both of us." I wanted to argue, tell him he didn't have to go, but deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep dancing around this, whatever this was. Distance was the only way to hit reset. "Okay," I said, my voice barely there. "I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," he said, and the way he looked at me, like he meant it more than he should, cut deep. He turned and walked out, leaving me staring at the stove, sponge dripping onto the counter. The next morning he was gone before I got up. I found Dan in the kitchen sipping coffee, oblivious as ever. "Jake took off to his mom's," he grunted, flipping through his phone. "Kids need space, I guess." "Yeah," I mumbled, pouring myself a cup. The house felt hollow without Jake's quiet presence, like a piece of it had peeled away. I stood by the window watching his beat-up Toyota disappear down the street, and my heart sank. It was the right call, but it hurt more than I'd expected. Weeks passed in a blur. Dan kept doing his thing. Work, drink, sleep, and I threw myself into routine. Laundry, dishes, groceries, repeat. Jake texted sometimes, short updates about classes or his mum's cooking, but it was polite, distant, like we were strangers now. I'd stare at my phone after every message, wondering if I'd made the right choice letting him go. The guilt faded a little, but the ache didn't. One night, after Dan crashed early, I ended up on the couch, flipping channels without really watching. The quiet was suffocating, pressing in on me. I heard footsteps and looked up. Jake stood in the doorway, hesitating. My heart jumped. "Can we talk?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, muting the TV. He sat on the other end of the couch, the space between us feeling too big and too small all at once. "What's up?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "I don't want things to be weird," he said, staring at the floor. "But I can't act like nothing happened." I sighed, leaning back. "Jake, we can't keep digging this up. It's done. We've got to move on." "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you're the one person who's always been there. I don't want to lose that." "You won't," I said, sharper than I meant. "But we need rules. No more whatever that was." He nodded, slow, like it cost him something. "I'll try. It's just not easy." "I get it," I said, softer now. "But it's the only way." We sat there, the silence heavy, but not awful. He stood eventually, hands back in his pockets. "Good night, Lindsay." "Night," I said, watching him go. I told myself we'd figure it out, that time would smooth it over. But as I sat there, staring at the blank TV, doubt gnawed at me. Could we really go back? A few days later, I was folding towels in the laundry room when my phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "Mum's place is good. Helps to breathe." I smiled, typing back a quick, "Glad you're settling in." Routine took over again. Dan, the house, me, but the edge was gone. Maybe we'd dodged the bullet. Maybe we could heal. Then, late one Friday, I was wiping down the kitchen counter when the doorbell rang. Dan was out with buddies, so I shuffled over, expecting a delivery guy. I swung the door open, and my breath stopped. Jake stood there, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, eyes locked on mine. "I couldn't stay away," he said, voice rough. "I tried, Lindsay. I swear I tried." My heart pounded, a mix of shock and something else. Relief? Fear? I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, he dropped the bag and stepped forward, pulling me into a hug. Not a kiss, just a tight, desperate hug, like he was holding on for dear life. I froze, then hugged him back, my hands trembling against his jacket. The world tilted, and I didn't know if I was falling or flying. "Jake, what are you—" I started, but he cut me off, pulling back just enough to look at me. "I found something," he said, digging into his pocket. He pulled out a folded letter, worn at the edges, and handed it to me. "It's from Dad, to my mum, dated 10 years ago." I stared at it, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. Dan's handwriting, messy, unmistakable, spilled across the page. My eyes caught the first line. "I've been seeing someone else. I'm sorry." The date hit me like a punch. It was a year before he married me. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking up at Jake. His face was pale, jaw tight. "He cheated on her," he said, voice breaking. "And maybe on you too." The room spun. Everything I'd built, everything I'd buried with Jake, it cracked open. And then the front door slammed. Dan was home. If you loved this, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, drop a comment, and pass it along to your buddies.
This is an artistic and fictional creation intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. Some scenes and dialogues in the video are part of a dramatized performance and incorporate elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator stands against discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel fully complies with YouTube's policies and does not infringe upon copyright laws.